Chapter 15, Part 1, of The Shades of the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Shades of the Wilderness, by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15, The Wilderness, Part 1. When night settled down over the wilderness, the two armies lay almost face to face on a long line. The preliminary battle, on the whole, had favored the Confederacy. Hill had held his ground and Ewell had gained, but Grant had immense forces, and, though naturally kind of heart, he had made up his mind to strike and keep on striking no matter what the loss. He could afford to lose 2 men where the Confederacy lost 1. Harry, like many others, felt that this would be the great Northern general's plan. Tomorrow's battle might end in Southern success, but Grant would be there to fight the following day with undiminished resolution. He was as sure of this as he was sure that the day would come. The night itself was somber and sinister, the heavens dusky and a raw chill in the air. Heavy vapors rose from the marshes, and clouds of smoke from the afternoon's battle floated about over the thickets, poisoning the air as if with gas, and making the men cough as they breathed it. It made Harry's heart beat harder than usual, and his head felt as if it were swollen. Everything seemed clothed in a black mist, with a slightly reddish tint. A small fire had been built in a sheltered place for the commander-in-chief and his staff, and the cooks were preparing the supper, which was of the simplest kind. While they ate the food and drank their coffee, the darkness increased, with the faint lights of other fires showing here and there through it. Around the muddy places, frogs croaked in defiance of armies, and from distant points came the crackling of skirmishers prowling in the dusk. Harry's horse, saddled and bridled, was tied to a bush not far away. He knew that it was to be no night of rest for him or any other member of the staff. Lee would be sending messages continually. Longstreet, although he had been marching hard, was not yet up on the right, and he and his veterans must be present when the shock of Grant's mighty attack came in the morning. Hill, thin and pale, yet suffering from the effects of his wounds, but burning as usual with the fire of battle, rode up and consulted long and earnestly with Lee. Presently he went back to his own place nearer the center, and then Lee began to send away his staff one by one with messages. Harry was among the last to go, but he bore a dispatch to Longstreet. He had heard that Longstreet had criticized Lee for ordering Pickett's famous charge at Gettysburg, but if so, Lee had taken no notice of it, and Longstreet had proved himself the same stalwart fighter as of old. He and the prompt arrival of his veterans had enabled Bragg to win Chickamauga, and it was not Longstreet's fault that the advantage gained there was lost afterward. Now Harry knew that he would be up in time with his seasoned veterans. As the young lieutenant rode away, he saw General Lee walking back and forth before the low fire, his hands clasped behind him, and his eyes as serious as those of any human being could be. Harry appreciated the immensity of his task, and in his heart was a sincere pity for the man who bore such a great burden. He was familiar with the statement that to Lee had been offered the command of the Northern armies at the beginning of the war, but believing his first duty was to his state, he had gone with Virginia when Virginia reluctantly went out of the Union. Truly, no one could regret the war more than he, and yet he had struck giant blows for its success. A moment more and the tall figure standing beside the low fire was lost to sight. Then Harry rode among the thickets in the rear of the Confederate line, and it was a weird and ghastly ride. Now and then his horse's feet sank in mud, and the frogs still dared to croak around the pools, making on such a night the most ominous of all sounds. It seemed a sort of funeral dirge for both North and South, a croak telling of the ruin and death that were to come on the morrow. Damp boughs swept across his face, and the vapors rising from the earth and mingled with the battle smoke were still bitter to the tongue and poisonous to the breath. Rotten logs crushed beneath his horse's feet, and Harry felt a shiver as if the hooves had cut through a body of the dead. Riflemen rose out of the thickets, but he always gave them the password and rode on without stopping. Then came a space where he met no human being, the gap between Hill and Longstreet, and now the wilderness became incredibly lonely and dreary. Harry felt that if ever a region was haunted by ghosts, it was this. The dead of last year's battle might be lying everywhere, and as the breeze sprang up, the melancholy thickets waved over them. He was 2/3 of the way toward the point where he expected to find Longstreet, when he heard the sough of a hoof in the mud behind him. Harry listened, and hearing the hoof again, he was instantly on his guard. He did not know it, but the character of the night and the wild aspect of the wilderness were bringing out all the primeval and elemental qualities of his nature. He was the great borderer Henry Ware in the Indian-haunted forest, feeling with a sixth sense, even a seventh sense, the presence of danger. He was following a path scarcely traceable, used by charcoal burners and woodcutters. But when he heard the hoof a second time, he turned aside into the deepest of the thickets and halted there. The hoofbeat came a third time, a little nearer, and then no more. Evidently the horseman behind him knew that he had turned aside and was waiting and watching. He was surely an enemy of great skill and boldness, and it was equally sure that he was Shepard. Harry never felt a doubt that he was pursued by the formidable Union spy, and he felt, too, that he had never been in greater danger, as Shepard, at such a moment, would not spare his best friend. But he was not afraid. Danger had become so common that one looked upon it merely as a risk. Moreover, he was never cooler or more ample of resource. He dismounted softly, standing beside his horse's head, holding the reins with one hand and a heavy pistol with the other. He suspected that Shepard would do the same, but he believed that his eyes and ears were the keener. The man must have been inside the Confederate lines all the afternoon. Probably he had seen Harry riding away, and, deftly appropriating a horse, had followed him. There was no end to Shepard's ingenuity and daring. Harry's horse was trained to stand still indefinitely, and the young man, with the heavy pistol, who held the reins, was also immovable. The silence about him was so deep that Harry could hear the frogs croaking at a distant pool. He waited a full 5 minutes, and now, like the wild animals, he relied more upon ear than eye. He had learned the faculty of concentration, and he bent all his powers upon his hearing. Not the slightest sound could escape the tightly drawn drums of his ears. He was motionless a full 10 minutes, nor did the horse beside him stir. It was a test of human endurance, the capacity to keep himself absolutely silent, but with every nerve attuned, while he waited for an invisible danger. And those minutes were precious, too. The value of not a single one of them could have been measured or weighed. It was his duty to reach Longstreet at speed, because the general and his veterans must be in line in the morning when the battle was joined. Yet the incessant duel between Shepard and himself was at its height again, and he did not yet see how he could end it. Harry felt that it must be essentially a struggle of patience. But when he waited a few minutes longer, the idea to wait with ears close to the earth, one of the oldest devices of primitive man, occurred to him. It was fairly dry in the bushes, and he lay down, pressing his ear to the soil. Then he heard a faint sound, as if someone crawling through the grass, like a wild animal stalking its prey. It was Shepard, of course, and Harry planned his campaign. Shepard had left his horse, and was endeavoring to reach him by stealth. Leaving his own horse, he crept a little to the right, and then rising carefully in another thicket, he picked out every dark spot in the gloom. He made out presently the figure of a riderless horse, standing partly behind the trunk of an oak, larger than most of those that grew in the wilderness. Harry knew that it was Shepard's mount, and that Shepard himself was some distance in front of it, creeping toward the thicket which he supposed sheltered his foe. There was barely enough light for Harry to see the horse's head, and regretfully he raised his heavy pistol. But it had to be done, and when his aim was true, he pulled the trigger. The report of the pistol was almost like the roar of a cannon in the desolate wilderness, and it made Harry himself jump. Then he promptly threw himself flat upon his face. Shepard's answering fire came from a point about 30 yards in front of the horse, and the bullet passed very close over Harry's head. It was a marvelous shot to be made merely at the place from which a sound had come, and it passed in a flash. And the next moment Harry heard the sound of a horse falling and kicking a little. Then it too was still. He remained only half a minute in the grass. Then he began to creep back, curving a little in his course toward his own horse. He did not believe that Shepard's faculty of hearing was as keen as his own, and he moved with the greatest deftness. He relied upon the fact that Shepard had not yet located the horse, and if Harry could reach it quickly, it would not be hard for him, a mounted man, to leave behind Shepherd dismounted. It might be possible, too, that Shepherd had gone back to see about his own horse, not knowing that it was slain. He saw the dusky outline of his horse, and, rising, made 2 or 3 jumps. Then he snatched the reins loose, sprang upon his back, and, lying down upon his neck to avoid bullets, crashed away, reckless of bushes and briars. He heard one bullet flying near him, but he laughed in delight and relief as his horse sped on toward Longstreet. He did not diminish his speed until he had gone 2 or 3 miles, and then, knowing that Shepherd had been left hopelessly behind, even if he had attempted pursuit, he brought his horse down to a walk and laughed. There was a bit of nervous excitement in the laugh. He had outwitted Shepherd again. He had never seen the man, but it did not enter his mind that it was not he. Each had scored largely over the other from time to time, but Harry believed that he was at least even. He steadied his nerves now and rode calmly toward Longstreet, coming soon upon his scouts, who informed him that the heavy columns were not far behind, marching with stalwart step to their appointed place in the line. But it was Harry's business to see Longstreet himself, and he continued his way toward the center of the division, where they told him the general could be found. He rode forward and in the moonlight recognized Longstreet at once, a heavy-set, bearded man, mounted on a strong bay horse. He had a very small staff, and he was the first to notice the young lieutenant advancing. He knew Harry well, having seen him with Lee at Gettysburg and with Jackson before. He stopped and said abruptly, "You come from the commander-in-chief, do you not?" "Yes, sir," replied Harry, "and I've been coming as fast as I could." He did not deem it necessary to say anything about his encounter with Shepherd. "There has been heavy fighting. What are his orders?" Harry told him, also giving him a written message which the general read by the light of a torch an aide held. "You can tell General Lee that all my men will be in position for battle before dawn," said the Georgian crisply. Even as he spoke, Harry heard the heavy, regular tread of the brigades marching forward through the wilderness. He saluted Longstreet. "I shall return at once with your message," he said. But Harry, having had one such experience, was resolved not to risk another. He would make a wider circuit in the rear of the army. Shepherd, on foot, and anxious to avenge his defeat, might be waiting for him, but he would go around him. So, when he started back, he made a wide curve, and soon was in the darkness and silence again. He had a good horse, and his idea of direction being very clear, he rode swiftly in the direction he had chosen. But his curve was so great that when he reached the center of it, he was so far in the rear of the army that no sound came from it. If the skirmishers were still firing, the reports of their rifles were lost in the distance. Where he rode, the only noises were those made by the wild animals that inhabited the wilderness, creatures that had settled back into their usual haunts after the armies had passed beyond. Once a startled deer ran from a clump of bushes and crashed away through the thickets. Rabbits darted from his path, and an owl, wondering what all the disturbance was about, hooted mournfully from a bough. Long before dawn, Harry reached the Southern sentinels in the center and was then passed to General Lee, who remained at the same camp, sitting on a log by some smothered coals. Several other members of his staff had returned already, and the general, looking up when Harry came forward, merely said, "Well, I have seen General Longstreet, sir," said Harry, "and he bids me tell you that he and his men will be in position before dawn. He was nearly up when I left, and he has also sent you this note." He handed the note to General Lee, who, bending over the coals, read it. "Everything goes well," he said with satisfaction. "We shall be ready for them. What time is it, Peyton?" 5 minutes to 4 o'clock, sir." "Then I think the attack should come within an hour." "Perhaps before daybreak, sir?" "Perhaps. And even before the sun begins to rise, it will be like twilight in this gloomy place." Grant, in truth, prompt and ready as always, had ordered the advance to be begun at 4:30. But Meade, asking more time for arrangements, and requesting that it be delayed until 6, he had consented to a postponement until 5 o'clock and no more. Harry had one more message to carry, a short distance only, and on his return he found the Invincibles posted on the commander-in-chief's right, and not more than 200 yards away. "You must be the bodyguard for the general," he said to Colonel Leonidas Talbot. "There could be no greater honor for the Invincibles, nor could General Lee have a better guard." "I'm sure of that, sir." "What's happening, Harry? Tell us what's been going on in the night." "Our line of battle has been formed. General Longstreet and his men on the right are soon to be in touch with General Hill. I returned from him a little while ago. I can't yet smell the dawn, but I think the battle will come before then." Harry rode back and resumed his place beside Dalton. The troops everywhere were on their feet, cannon and rifles ready, because it was a certainty that the two armies would meet very early. In fact, the Army of Northern Virginia began to slide slowly forward. It was not in the habit of these troops to await attack. Lee nearly always had taken the offensive, and the motion of his men was involuntary. They felt that the enemy was there and they must go to meet them. "What time is it now?" whispered Dalton. Harry was barely able to discern the face of his watch. 10 minutes to 5, he replied, "and the dawn comes early. It won't be long before Grant comes poking his nose through the wilderness." Harry was silent. A few minutes more, and there was a sudden crackle of rifles in front of them. "The dawn isn't here, but Grant is," said Harry. The crackling fire doubled and tripled, and then the fire of the Southern rifles replied in heavy volume. The lighter field guns opened with a crash, and the heavier batteries followed with a rolling thunder. Leaves and twigs fell in showers, and men fell with them. The deep northern cheer swelled through the wilderness, and the fierce rebel yell replied. Gray dawn, rising as if with effort over the sodden wilderness, found 200,000 men locked fast in battle. It might have been a bright sun elsewhere, but not here among the gloomy shades in the pine barrens. The firing was already so tremendous that the smoke hung low and thick, directly over the tops of the bushes, and the men, as they fought, breathed mixed in frightful vapors. Both sides fought for a long time in a heavy, smoky dusk that was practically night. Officers coming from far points led compass in hand, having no other guide save the roar of battle. As the Southern leaders had foreseen, Grant was throwing in the full strength of his powerful army, hoping with superior numbers and better equipment to crush Lee utterly that day. The great Northern artillery was raking the whole Southern front. Hancock the Superb was hurling the heavy Northern masses directly upon the main position of the South. He had half the Army of the Potomac, and at the other points Warren, Wadsworth, Sedgwick, and Burnside were advancing with equal energy and contempt of death. Fiercer and fiercer grew the conflict. Hancock, remembering how he had held the fatal hill at Gettysburg, and resolved to win a complete victory now, poured in regiment after regiment. But in all the fire and smoke and excitement and danger, he did not neglect to keep a cool head. Hearing that a position of Longstreet's corps was near, he sent a division and numerous heavy artillery to attack it, driving it back after a sanguinary struggle of more than an hour. Then he redoubled his attack upon the Southern center, compelling it to give ground, though slowly. Harry felt that gliding movement backward, and a chill ran through his blood. The heavy masses of Grant and his powerful artillery were prevailing. The strongest portion of the Southern army was being forced back, and a gap was cut between Hill and Longstreet. Had Hancock perceived the gap that he had made, he might have severed the Southern army, inflicting irretrievable retreat, but the smoke and dusk of the wilderness hid it, and the moment passed into one of the great ifs of history. Harry on horseback witnessed this conflict, all the more terrible because of the theater in which it was fought. The batteries and the riflemen alike were frequently hidden by the thickets. The great banks of smoke hung low, only to be split apart incessantly by the flashes of fire from the big guns. But the bullets were more dangerous than the cannonballs and shells. They whistled and shrieked in thousands and countless thousands. Lee sat on his horse impassive, watching as well as he could the tide of battle. Messengers covered with smoke and sweat had informed him of the gap between Hill and Longstreet, and he was dispatching fresh troops to close it up. Harry saw the Invincibles march by. The two colonels at their head beheld Lee on his white horse, and their swords flew from their scabbards as they made a salute in perfect unison. Close behind them rode St. Clair and Happy Tom, and they too saluted in like manner. Lee took off his hat in reply, and Harry choked. "About to die, we salute thee," he murmured under his breath. Then with a shout the Invincibles, their officers at their head, plunged into the fire and smoke, and were lost from Harry's view. But he could not stay there long and wonder at their fate. In a few minutes he was riding to Longstreet with a message for him to bear steadily toward Hill, that the gap might be closed entirely and as soon as possible. He galloped behind the lines, and bullets fell all around him, and often a shell tore the earth. The air had become more bitter and poisonous. Fumes from swamps seemed to mingle with the smoke and odors of burnt gunpowder. His lips and his tongue were scorched, but he kept on without exhaustion or mishap and reached Longstreet, who had divined his message. "The line will be solid in a few minutes," he said, and while the battle was still at its height on the long front, he touched hands with Hill. Then both drove forward with all their might against Hancock, rushing to the charge with the Southern fire and recklessness of death that had proved irresistible on so many fields. The advance, despite the most desperate efforts of Hancock and his generals, was stopped. Then he was driven back. All the ground gained at so much cost was lost, and the Southern troops, shouting in exultation, pushed on, pouring in a terrible rifle fire. Longstreet, in his eagerness, rode a little ahead of his troops to see the result. Turning back, he was mistaken in the smoke by his own men for a Northern cavalryman, and they fired upon him, just as Jackson had been shot down by his own troops in the dusk at Chancellorsville. The leader fell from his horse, wounded severely, and the troops advancing to victory became confused. The rumor spread that Longstreet had been killed. There was no one to give orders, and the charge stopped. Harry and a half-dozen others who had seen the accident or heard of it galloped to Lee, who at once rode into the very thick of the command, giving personal orders and sending his aides right and left with others. The whole division was reformed under his eye, and he sent it anew to the attack. End of Chapter 15, Part 1. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. Chapter 15, Part 2 of The Shades of the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Shades of the Wilderness by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15. The Wilderness. Part 2. The battle now closed in with the full strength of both armies. Hancock strove to keep his place. The valiant Wadsworth had been killed already. The dense thickets largely nullified Grant's superior numbers. Lee poured everything on Hancock, who was driven from every position. Fighting furiously behind a breastwork built the night before, he was driven from that too. Often in the dense shades the soldiers met one another face to face, and furious struggles hand to hand ensued. Brushes and trees, set on fire by the shells, burned slowly like torches put there to light up the ghastly scene of man's bravery and folly. Jenkins, a Confederate general, was killed, and colonels and majors fell by the dozen, but neither side would yield, and Grant hurried help to his hard-pressed troops. Harry had been grazed on the shoulder by a bullet, but his horse was unharmed, and he kept close to Lee, who continued to direct the battle personally. He knew they were advancing. Once more the genius of the great Confederate leader was triumphing. Grant, the redoubtable and tenacious despite his numbers, could set no trap for him. Instead, he had been drawn into battle on a field of Lee's own choosing. The conflict had now continued for a long time, and was terrible in all its aspects. It was far past noon, and for miles a dense cloud of smoke hung over the wilderness, which was filled with the roar of cannon, the crash of rifles, and the shouts of 200,000 men in deadly conflict. The first meeting of the two great protagonists of the war, Lee and Grant, was sanguinary and terrible beyond all expectation. Hundreds fell dead, their bodies lying hidden among the thickets. The forests burned fiercely here and there, casting circles of lurid light over the combatants, while the wind rained down charred leaves and twigs. The fire spread and joined, and at all points swept wide areas of the forest, yet the fury of the battle was not diminished, the two armies forgetting everything else in their desire to crush each other. Harry's horse was killed as he sat near Lee, but he quickly obtained another, and not long afterward he was sent with a second message to Ewell. He rode on a long battle front, not far behind the lines, and he shuddered with awe as he looked up upon the titanic struggle. The smoke was often so heavy and the bushes so thick that he could not see the combatants except for the flame of the firing or the burning trees lighted up a segment of the circle. Halfway to Ewell, he stopped when he saw two familiar figures sitting on a log. They were elderly men in uniforms riddled by bullets. The right arm of one and the left leg of the other were tightly bandaged. Their faces were very white, and it was obvious that they were sitting there because they were not strong enough to stand. Harry stopped. No message, no matter how important, could have kept him from stopping. "Colonel Talbot! Colonel St. Hilaire!" he cried. "Yes, here we are, Harry," replied Colonel Leonidas Talbot, in a voice thin but full of courage. "Hector has been shot through the leg and has lost much blood, but I have bound up his wound, and he has done as much for my arm, which has been bored through from side to side by a bullet which must have been as large as my fist." "And so for a few minutes," said Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire valiantly, "we must let General Lee conduct the victory alone." "And the Invincibles?" exclaimed Harry, horrified. "Are they all gone but you?" "Not at all," replied Colonel Talbot. "There's so much smoke about that you can't see much, but if it clears a little you will behold Lieutenant St. Clair and the youth rightly called Happy Tom, and some 60 others, lying among the bushes not far ahead of you, giving thorough attention to the enemy." "And that is all that's left of the Invincibles?" "It's a wonder that there's so many. You were right about this man, Grant, Harry. He's a fighter, and their artillery is numerous and wonderful. John Carrington himself must be in front of us. We have not seen him, but the circumstantial evidence is conclusive. Nobody else in the world could have swept this position of the Wilderness with shell and shrapnel in such a manner. Why, he has mowed down the bushes in long swaths as the scythe takes the grass, and he has cut down our men with them. How does the battle go elsewhere?" "We're succeeding. We're driving 'em back. I can only stop a moment now. I'm on my way to General Ewell." "Then hurry. Don't be worried about us. I'll help Hector, and Hector will help me. And do your curve further to the rear, Harry. The worst thing that a dispatcher bearer can do is get himself shot." Waving his hand in farewell, Harry galloped away. He knew that Colonel Talbot had given him sound advice, and he bore back from the front, coming once more into lonely thickets, although the flash of battle was plainly visible in front of him, and its roar filled his ears. Yet when he rode alone, he almost expected to see Shepard rise up before him and bid him halt. His encounters with this man had been under such startling circumstances that it now seemed the rule and not the exception for him to appear at any moment. But Shepard did not come. Instead, Harry began to see the badly wounded of his own side drifting to the rear, helping one another as hurt soldiers learn to do. 2 of them he allowed to hang on his stirrups a little while. "They are fighting hard," said one, a long, gaunt Texan, "and there's so many they might lap round us. This man of theirs, Grant, ain't much of a fellow to get scared, but I guess Marse Bob will take care of him just as he took care of the others who came into Virginia." "They're led in the main attack by Hancock," said another, a Virginian. "I caught a glimpse of him through the smoke, just as I had a view of him for a minute back there by a clump of trees on the ridge at Gettysburg." "Are you one of Pickett's men?" asked Harry. "I am, sir, one of the few that's left. I went to clear the clump of trees, and how I got back I've never known. It was sort of a red dream in which I couldn't pick out anything in particular, but I was back with the army carrying 3 bullets that the doctors took away from me, and here I've gathered up 2 more they'll rob me of in just the same way." He spoke quite cheerfully, and when Harry, curving again, was compelled to release them, both, although badly wounded, wished him good luck. He found General Ewell in front, stamping back and forth on his crutches, watching the battle with excitement. "And you're here again, Harry. Well, it's good news at present," he cried. "It seems that their man Grant is going to school to lead just like the others. But them pupils learn too fast, sir." "That's so. But, Harry, I wish I could see more of the field. An invisible battle like this shakes my nerves. Batteries that we can't see send tornadoes of shot and shell among us. Riflemen by the thousands hidden in the thickets rain bullets into our ranks. It's inhuman, wicked, and our only salvation lies in the fact that it's as bad for them as it is for us. If we can't see them, they can't see us." "You can hold your ground here?" "Against anything and everything. Tell General Lee that we intend to eat our suppers on the enemy's ground." "That's all he wants to know." As Harry rode back, he saw that the first fires were spreading, passing over new portions of the battlefield. Sparks flew in myriads, and fine, thin ashes were mingled with the powder smoke. The small trees, burnt through, fell with a crash, and the flames ran as if they were alive up boughs. Other trees fell too, cut through by cannon balls, and some were actually mown down by sheets of bullets, as if they had been grass. His way now led through human wreckage, made all the more appalling by the approaching twilight, heavy with fumes and smoke, and reddened with the cannon and rifle blaze. His frightened horse pulled wildly at the bit and tried to run away, but Harry held him to the path, although he stepped more than once in hot ashes and sprang wildly. The dead were thick, too, and Harry was in horror lest the hoof of his horse be planted upon some unheeding face. He knew that the day was waning fast, and that the dark was due in some degree to the setting sun, and not wholly to the smoke and ashes. Yet the fury of battle was sustained. The Southern left maintained the ground that it had gained, and in the center and the right it could not be driven back. It became obvious to Grant that Lee was not to be beaten in the Wilderness. His advance suffered from all kinds of disadvantages. In the swamps and thickets he could mass neither his guns nor his cannon. Communications were broken. The telegraph wires could be used but little, and as the twilight darkened to night, he let the attack die. Harry was back with the commander-in-chief when the great battle of the Wilderness, one of the fiercest ever fought, sank under the cover of the night. It was not open and spectacular like Gettysburg, but it had a gloomy and savage grandeur all its own. Grant had learned, like the others before him, that he could not drive headlong over Lee, but sitting in silence by his campfire, chewing his cigar, he had no thought, unlike the others, of turning back. Nearly 20,000 of his men had fallen, but huge resources and a president who supported him absolutely were behind him, and he was merely planning a new method of attack. In the Southern camp there was exultation, but it was qualified and rather grim. These men, veterans of many battles, and able to judge for themselves, believed that they had won the victory, but they knew that it was by no means decisive. The numerous foe with his powerful artillery was still before them. They could see his campfire shining through the thickets, and their spies told them that, despite his great losses, there was no sign of retreat in Grant's camp. An appalling night settled down on the Wilderness. The North American continent never saw one more savage and terrible. 20,000 wounded were scattered through the thickets and dense shades, and spreading fire soon brought death to many whom the bullets had not killed at once. The smoke, the mists, and vapors gathered into one dense cloud that hung low and made everything clammy to the touch. Lee stood under the boughs of an oak and ate food that had been prepared for him hastily. But as Harry saw, the act was purely mechanical. He was watching as well as he could what was going on in front, and he was giving orders in turns to his aides. Harry's time had not yet come, and he kept his eyes on his chief. There was no exultation in the face of Lee. He had drawn Grant into the Wilderness, and then he had held him fast in a battle of uncommon size and fierceness, but nothing was decided. He had studied the career of Grant, and he knew that he had a foe of great qualities with whom to deal. He would have to fight him again and fight very soon. He heard, too, with a sorrow hard to conceal, the reports of his own losses. They were heavy enough, and the gaps now made could never be refilled. The Army of Northern Virginia, which had been such a powerful instrument in his hands, must fight with ever-diminishing numbers. Harry was sent to inquire into the condition of Longstreet, whom he found weak physically and suffering much pain. But the veteran was upborne by the success of the day and his belief in ultimate victory. He bade Harry tell the commander-in-chief that his men were fit to fight again and better than ever at the first shoot of dawn. Harry rode back in the night, the burning trees serving him for torches. Nearly all the soldiers were busy. Some were gathering up the wounded, and others were building breastworks. His eyes were reddened by the powder smoke, and often the heavy, black masses of vapor were impenetrable, save where the forest burned. Now he came to a region where the dead and wounded were so thick that he dismounted and led his horse, lest a hoof be planted upon any one of them. But he noticed that here, as in other battles, the wounded made but little complaint. They suffered in silence, waiting for their companions to take them away. Then he passed under a section of forest that was burning fiercely. Here, Southern and Union soldiers had met on terms of peace and were making desperate efforts to save their helpless comrades. Harry would have been glad to give aid himself, but he was too well trained now to turn aside when he rode for Lee. He saw many dark figures passing before the flaming background, and as he walked more slowly than he thought, he saw one that looked remarkably familiar to him. It was impossible to see the face, but he knew the walk and lift of the shoulders. Discipline gave way to impulse now, and he ran forward, crying, "Dick! Dick!" Dick Mason, who had just dragged a wounded man beyond the range of the flames, turned at the sound of the voice. Even had Harry seen his face at first, he would not have known him, nor would Dick have known Harry. Both were black with ashes, smoke, and burned gunpowder. But Dick knew the voice at an instant. Once more were the two cousins to meet in peace on an unfinished battlefield. Each driven by the same impulse stepped forward, and their hands met in a strong grasp of blood kindred and friendship, which war itself could not sever. "You're alive, Harry," said Dick. "It seems almost impossible after what has happened today. And you too are all right, not harmed, I see, though your face is an African black. I should call your own color dark and smoky. I wasn't sure that you were in the East. When did you come?" "With General Grant, and I knew you were on General Lee's staff. I have a message to give him by you. Oh, you needn't laugh. It's a good straight talk." "Go ahead, then, and say it to me." "You say to General Lee that it's all over. Tell him to quit and send his soldiers home. If he doesn't, he'll be crushed." Harry laughed again and waved his finger at the somber battlefield upon which he stood. "Does this look like it?" he asked. "We're farther forward tonight than we were in the morning. Wouldn't General Grant be glad if he could say as much?" "It makes no difference. I know you don't believe me, but it's so. The North is prepared as it never was before, and Grant will hammer and hammer forever. We know what a man Lee is. The whole North admits it. But I tell you that the sun of the South is setting." "You're growing poetical, and poetry is no argument." "But unlimited men, unlimited cannon and rifles, unlimited ammunition and supplies, and a general who's willing to use them are. Of course I know that you can't carry such a message to General Lee, but I feel it to be the truth." "We've a great general and a great army that say no." Nobody paid any attention to the two. It was merely another one of those occasions when men of the opposing side stood together amid the dead and wounded and talked in a friendly fashion. But Harry knew that he could not delay long. "I've got to go, Dick," he said. "And I've a message, too, one that I want you to deliver to General Grant." "What is it?" "Tell him that we've more than held our own today, and that we'll thrash him like thunder tomorrow, and whenever and wherever he may choose, no matter what the odds are against us." Dick laughed. "I see you won't believe even a little bit of what I tell you," he said. "And maybe if I were in your place I wouldn't either. But it's true all the same. Goodbye, Harry." The two hands covered with battle grime met again in a strong grasp of blood kindred and friendship. "Take care of yourself, old man." The words, exactly alike, were uttered by the two simultaneously. Both were stirred deeply. Harry sprang on his horse, looked back once more, waving his hand, and rode rapidly to General Lee. Later in the night, he received permission to hunt up the Invincibles, his heart full of fear that they had perished utterly in the gloomy pit called the Wilderness, lit now only by the fire of death. He left his horse with an orderly and walked toward the point where he had last seen them. He passed thousands of soldiers, many wounded, but silent as usual, while the unhurt were sleeping where they had dropped. The Invincibles were not at the point where he had seen them last, and the colonels of several scattered regiments could not tell him what had become of them. But he continued to seek them, although the fear was growing in his heart that the last man of the Invincibles had died under the Northern cannon. His search led toward the enemy's lines. Almost unconsciously, he went in that direction, however, his knowledge of the two colonels telling him that they would take the same course. He turned into a little cove, partly sheltered by the dwarf trees, and he heard a thin voice saying, "Nonsense, Leonidas, I scarcely felt it. But yours, old friend, is pretty bad. Let me attend to it. Keep still. I'll adjust the bandage. Hector, why do you make a fuss over me when I'm only slightly hurt, and sacrifice yourself, a severely injured man?" "With all due respect, you'd better let me attend to you both," said a voice that Harry recognized as St. Clair's. "And maybe I could help a little," said another that he knew to be Happy Tom. But their voices, like those of the colonels, were weak. Still, he had positive proof that they were alive, and as his heart gave a joyful throb or two, he stepped into the glade. There was enough light for him to see Colonel Leonidas Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire sitting side by side on the grass with their backs against the earthly wall, very pale from loss of blood, but with heads erect and eyes shining with a certain pride. St. Clair and Langdon lay on the grass, one with an old handkerchief, blood-soaked, bound about his head, and the other with a bandage tightly fastened over his left shoulder. Beyond them lay a group of soldiers. "Good evening, heroes," said Harry lightly as he stepped forward. He was welcomed with an exclamation of joy from them all. "We meet again, Harry," said Colonel Talbot, "and it is the second time since morning. I fancy that second meetings today have not been common. We have the taste of success in our mouths, but you'll excuse us for not rising to greet you. We are all more or less affected by the missiles of the enemy, and for some hours at least, neither walking nor standing will be good for us." "Mohammed must come to all the mountains," said St. Clair weakly, holding out a hand. Harry greeted them in turn and sat down with them. He was overflowing with sympathy, but it was not needed. "A glorious day," said Colonel Leonidas Talbot. "Truly," said Harry. "A most glorious day," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. "Most truly," said Harry. "An especially glorious day for the Invincibles," said Colonel Talbot. "The most glorious of all possible days for the Invincibles," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. There was a special emphasis to their words that aroused Harry's attention. "The Invincibles have had many glorious days," he said. "Why should this be the most glorious of them all?" "We went into battle 147 strong," said Colonel Talbot quietly, "and we came out with 147 casualties, 39 killed and 108 wounded. We lay no claim to valor exceeding that of many other regiments in General Lee's glorious army, but we do think we've made a fairly excellent record. Do you see those men?" He pointed to a silent group stretched upon the turf. Harry nodded. "Not one of them has escaped unhurt. But most of us will muster strength enough to meet the enemy again tomorrow, when our great general calls." Harry's throat contracted for a moment. "I know it, Colonel Talbot," he said. "The Invincibles have proved themselves trustworthy of their name. General Lee shall hear of this." "But in no boastful vein, Harry," said Colonel Talbot. "We would not have you speak thus of your friends." "I do not have to boast for you. The simple truth is enough. I shall see that the surgeon comes here at once to attend to your wounded. Good night, gentlemen." "Good night," said the four together. Harry walked back to General Lee's headquarters, full of pride in his old comrades. End of Chapter 15, Part 2. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Shades of the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Shades of the Wilderness by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16. Spottsylvania. Part 1. Harry secured a little sleep toward morning, and although his nervous tension had been very great, when he lay down he felt greatly strengthened in body and mind. He awakened Dalton in turn, and the two, securing a hasty breakfast, sat near the older members of the staff awaiting orders. The commander-in-chief was at the edge of the little glade, talking earnestly with Hill and other important generals. Harry often saw through the medium of his own feelings, and the rim of the sun, beginning to show over the eastern edge of the wilderness, was blood-red. The same crimson and sinister tinge showed through the west, which was yet in the dusk. But in east and west there were certain areas of light where the forest fires yet smoldered. Both sides had thrown up hasty breastworks of earth or timber, but the two armies were unusually silent. A space of perhaps a mile and a half lay between them, but as the light increased, neither moved. There was no crackle of rifle fire along their fronts. The skirmishers, usually so active, seemed to be exhausted, and the big guns were at rest. The fierce and tremendous fighting of the 2 days before seemed to have taken all the life out of both North and South. Harry, inured to war, understood the reasons for silence and lack of movement. Grant had been drawn into a region that he did not like, where he could not use his superior numbers to advantage, and he must be shuddering at the huge losses he had suffered already. He would seek better ground. Lee, too, was in no condition to take advantage of his successful defense. The old days when he could send Jackson on a great turning movement to fall with all the crushing impact of a surprise upon the northern flank were gone forever. Stuart, the brilliant cavalryman, was there, but his men were not numerous enough, and, however brilliant, he was not Jackson. The sun rose higher. Mid-morning came, and the two armies still lay close. Harry grew stronger in his opinion that they would not fight again that day, although he watched like the others for any sign of movement in the northern camp. Noon came, and the same dead silence. The fires had burned themselves out now, and the dusk that had reigned over the wilderness before the battle recovered its ground, thickened yet further by the vast quantities of smoke still hanging low under a cloudy sky. But the aspect of the wilderness itself was more mournful than ever. Coals smoldered in the burned areas, and now and then puffs of wind picked up the hot ashes and sent them in the faces of the soldiers. Thickets and brushes had been cut down by bullets and cannonballs, and lay heaped together in tangled confusion. Back of the lines, the surgeons, with aching backs, toiled over the wounded as they had toiled through the night. Harry saw nearly the whole southern front. The members of Lee's staff were busy that day carrying orders to all his generals to rectify their lines and to be prepared to the last detail for another tremendous assault. It was not until afternoon that he was able to look up the Invincibles again. The two colonels and the two lieutenants were doing well, and the colonels were happy. "We've already been notified," said Colonel Talbot, "that we're to retain our organization as a regiment. We're to have about 100 new men now, fragments of destroyed regiments. Of course, they won't be like the veterans of the Invincibles, but a half-dozen battles like that of yesterday should lick them into shape." "I should think so," said Harry. "Do you believe that Grant is retreating?" asked Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire. "Our scouts don't say so." "Then he is merely putting off the evil day. The sooner he withdraws, the more men he will save. No Yankee general can ever get by General Lee. Keep that in your mind, Harry Kenton." Harry was silent, but rejoicing to find that his friends would soon recover from their wounds, he went back to his place and saw all the afternoon pass without any movement indicating battle. Night came again, and the scouts reported to Lee that the Union army was breaking camp, evidently with the intention of getting out of the wilderness and marching up to Fredericksburg. Harry was with the general when he received the news, and he saw him think over it long. Other scouts brought in the same evidence. Harry did not know what the general thought, but as for himself, although he was too young to say anything, it was incredible that Grant should retreat. It was not at all in accordance with his character, now tested on many fields, and his resources also were too great for withdrawal. But the night was very dark, and no definite knowledge yet came out of it. Lee stayed by his little campfire and received reports. Far after dusk, Harry saw the look of doubt disappear from his eyes, and then he began to send out messengers. It was evident that he had formed his opinion and intended to act upon it at once. He beckoned to Harry and Dalton, and bade them go together with written instructions to General Anderson, who had taken the place of General Longstreet. "You will stay with General Anderson, subject to his orders," he said, as Harry and Dalton, saluting, rode toward Anderson's command. Their way led through torn, tangled, and burned thickets. Sometimes a horse sprang violently to one side and neighed in pain. His hoof had come down on earth, yet so hot that it scorched like fire. Now and then sparks fell upon them, but they pursued their way, disregarding all obstacles, and delivered their sealed orders to General Anderson, who at once gathered up his full force and marched away from the heart of the wilderness toward Spottsylvania Courthouse. Harry surmised that Grant was attempting some great turning movement, and Lee, divining it, was sending Anderson to meet his advance. He never knew whether it was positive knowledge or a happy guess, but he was quite sure that the night's ride was one of the most singular and sinister ever made by an army. If any troops ever marched through the infernal regions, it was they. In this part of the wilderness the fires had been the worst. Trees still smoldered. In the hollows, where the bushes had burned the thickest, were great beds of coals. The smoke, which the low, heavy skies kept close to the earth, was thick and hot. Gusts of wind sent showers of sparks flying, and despite the greatest care to protect the ammunition, they marched in constant danger of explosion. Harry thought at one time that General Anderson intended to camp in the wilderness for the night, but he soon saw that it was impossible. One could not camp on hot ground in a smoldering forest. "I believe it's a march till day," he said to Dalton. "It's bound to be. If a man were to lie down here, he'd find himself a mass of cinders in the morning, and it will take us till daylight and maybe past that to get out of the wilderness. If he didn't burn to death, he'd choke to death. I never breathed such smoke before. It's because it's mixed with ashes and the fumes of burnt gunpowder. A villainous compound like this can't be called air. How long is it till dawn?" About 3 hours, I think. You remember those Greek stories about somebody or other going down to Hades and then having a hard climb out again? We're the modern imitators. If this isn't Hades, I don't know what is. It surely is. Whew, but that hurt. What happened? I brushed my hand against a burning bush. The result was not happy. Don't imitate me. Dalton's horse leapt to one side, and he had difficulty in keeping the saddle. His hoof had been planted squarely in the midst of a mass of hot twigs. The sooner I get out of this infernal or Hades of a place, the happier I'll be, said Dalton. I've never seen the like, said Harry, but there's one thing about it that makes me glad. And what's the saving grace? That it's in Virginia and not in Kentucky, though for the matter of that, it couldn't be in Kentucky. And why couldn't it be in Kentucky? 'Cause there ain't no such God-forsaken region in all that state of mine. It certainly gets upon one's soul, said Dalton, looking at the gloomy region so terribly torn by battle. But if we keep going, we're bound to come out of it at some time or another. And we're not stopping. A man can't make a bed on this mass of coals, and there be no rest for us until we're clear of the wilderness. They marched on a long time, and as day dawned, hundreds of voices united in a shout of gladness. Behind them were the shades of the wilderness, that dismal region reeking with slaughter and ruin, and before them lay firm soil and green fields, in all the flush of a brilliant May morning. Well, we did come out of Hades, Harry, said Dalton. And it does look like heaven. But the trouble with our Hades, George, is that the inmates will follow us. Put your glasses on your eyes and look over there. Horsemen, as sure as we're sitting in our own saddles. And northern horsemen, too. Their uniforms are new enough for me to tell their color. I take it that Grant's vanguard has moved by our right flank and has come out of the wilderness. And our surmises that we are to meet it are right. Spottsylvania courthouse is not far away, and maybe we are bound for it. And maybe the Yankees, too. Harry's words were caused by the sound of a distant and scattering fire. In obedience to an order from Anderson, he and Dalton galloped forward, and from a ridge saw through their glasses a formidable Union column advancing toward Spottsylvania. As they looked, they saw many men fall, and they also saw flashes of flame from bushes and fences not far from its flank. Our sharpshooters are there, said Harry, and he was right. While the Union force was advancing in the night, Stuart had dismounted many of his men, and, using them as skirmishers, had incessantly harassed the march of Grant's vanguard led by Warren. Each army has been trying to catch the other napping, said Dalton. And neither has succeeded, said Harry. Now we make a race for that Spottsylvania ridge, said Dalton. You see if we don't. I know this country. It's a strong position there, and both generals want it. Dalton was right. A small Union force had already occupied Spottsylvania, but the heavy Southern division crossing the narrow but deep River Po drove it out and seized the defensive position. Here they rested, while the masses of the two armies swung toward them, as if preparing for a new battlefield, one that Harry surveyed with great interest. They were in a land of numerous and deep rivers. Here were four spreading out like the fingers of a human hand without the thumb, and uniting at the wrist. The fingers were the Mat, the Ta, the Po, and the Ni, and the unit where they united was called the Mattapony. Lee's army was gathering behind the Po. A large Union force crossed it on his flank, but, recognizing the danger of such a position, withdrew. Lee himself came in time. Hill, overcome by illness and old wounds, was compelled to give up the command of his division, and Early took his place. Longstreet also was still suffering severely from his injuries. Lee had but few of the able and daring generals who had served him in so many fields. But Stuart, the gay and brilliant, the medieval knight who had such a strong place in the commander-in-chief's affections, was there, nor was his plumage one bit less splendid. The yellow feathers stood in his hat, and there was no speck or stain on the broad yellow sash, and his undimmed courage was contagious. But Harry, with his sensitive and imaginative mind that leapt ahead, knew their situation to be desperate. His opinion of Grant had proved to be correct, although he had found in Lee an opponent far superior to any other he had ever faced. The Union general, undaunted by his repulse and tremendous losses in the Wilderness, was preparing for a new battle, before the fire from the other had grown cold. He knew, too, that another strong Union army was operating far to the south of them, in order to cut them off from Richmond, and scouts had brought word that a powerful force of cavalry was about to circle upon their flank. The Confederacy was propped up alone by the Army of Northern Virginia, which, having just fought one great battle, was about to begin another, and by its daunting commander. The Southern admiration for Lee, both as the general and as the man, can never be shaken. How much greater then was the effect that he created in the mind of impressionable youth, looking upon him with youth's own eyes in his moments of supreme danger. He was in very truth to Harry another Hannibal as great and better. The long list of his triumphs, as youth counted them, was indeed superior to those of the great Carthaginian, and he believed that Lee would repel this new danger. End of Chapter 16, Part 1. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. Chapter 16, Part 2 of The Shades of the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Shades of the Wilderness by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16. Spottsylvania. Part 2. Nearly all that day the two armies constructed breastworks which stood for many years afterward, but neither made any attempt at serious work, although there was incessant firing by the skirmishers and an occasional cannon shot. Harry, whether carrying an order or not, had ample chance to see, and he noted with increasing alarm, the growing masses of the Union army as they gathered along the Spottsylvania front. "Can we beat them? Can we beat them?" was the question that he continually asked himself. He wondered, too, where the Winchester regiment and Dick Mason lay, and where the spy Shepard was. But Shepard was not likely to remain long in one place. Skill and courage such as his would be used to the utmost in a time like this. Doubtless he was somewhere in the Confederate lines, discovering for Grant the relatively small size of the army that opposed him. Nearing dusk, and having the time, he followed his custom and sought the Invincibles. Both colonels had recovered considerable strength, and, although one of them could not walk, he would be helped upon his horse whenever the battle began, and would ride into the thick of it. But the faces of St. Clair and Happy Tom glowed, and their wounds apparently were forgotten. "Lieutenant Arthur St. Clair and Lieutenant Thomas Langdon are gone forever," said Colonel Talbot. "In their places we have Major Arthur St. Clair and Captain Thomas Langdon. All our majors and captains have been killed, and with our reduced numbers these two will fill their places as best they can. And that they can do so most worthily we all know. They received their promotions this afternoon." Harry congratulated both of them with the greatest warmth. They were very young for such rank, but in this war the toll of officers was so great that men sometimes became generals when they were but little older. "Is it to be tomorrow?" asked Colonel Talbot. "I think it likely that we'll fight again then," said Harry. "And Grant has not yet had enough. He wants a little more of the same, does he?" "It would appear so, sir." "Then I take it without consulting General Lee that he is ready to deal with the Yankees as he dealt with them in the Wilderness." "I hope so. Good night." "Good night," they called to him, and Harry returned to the staff. Taylor, the adjutant general, told him and Dalton to lie down and seek a little sleep. Harry was not at all adverse, as he was completely exhausted again after the tremendous excitement of the battle and the long hours of strain and danger. But his nerves were so much on edge that he could not yet sleep. His eyes were red and smarting from the smoke and burned powder, and he felt as if accumulated smoke and dust encased him like a suit of armor. "I'd give $100 for a good long drink, just as long as I like to make it," he groaned. "And I mean drink of pure cold water, too." "Confederate paper or money," said Dalton. "I mean real money, but at the same time you oughtn't make invidious comparisons. Then the money's mine, and you can pay me whenever you feel like it, which I suppose will be never. There's a spring in the thick woods just back of your quarters. It flows out from under rocks. At a distance of several yards makes a deep pool, and then the overflow of the pool goes on through the forest to the Po. Come on, Harry, we'll luxuriate and then tell the others." Harry found that it was a most glorious spring, indeed clear and cold. He and Dalton drank slowly at first, and then deeply. "I didn't know I could hold so much," said Dalton. "Nor I," said Harry. "Let's take another." "I'm with you. Let's make it 2 more." "I still follow you."
Horace wrote about his old Philorian and the other wines which he enjoyed, as he and the leading Roman sport sat around the fountain flirting with the girls, said Dalton. But I don't believe any wine ever brewed in Latium was the equal to this water. I've always had an idea that Horace wasn't as gay as he pretended to be, else he wouldn't have written so much about Chloe and her comrades. I imagine that an old Roman boy would keep pretty quiet about his dancing and singing and not publish it to the public. Well, let him be. He's dead, and the Romans are dead, and the Americans are doing their best to kill off one another. But let's forget it for a few minutes. That pool is about 4 feet deep, and the water is clear, and the bottom is firm ground. Now, do you know what I'm going to do? Yes, and I'm going to do the same. I bet you even that I beat you into the water. Taken. They threw off their clothes rapidly, but the splashes were simultaneous as their bodies struck the water. Although the limits of the pool were narrow, they splashed and paddled there for a while, and it was a long time since they had known such a luxury. Then they walked out, dried themselves, and spread the good news. All night long the pool was filled with the bathers, following one another in turn. The water, taken internally and externally, soothed Harry's nerves. His excitement was gone. The great army with which they were sure to fight on the morrow was not far away, but for a time he was indifferent. The morrow would take care of itself. It was night, and he had permission to go to sleep. Hence he slumbered 15 minutes later. He slept almost through the night, and when he was awakened shortly before dawn, he found that his strength and elasticity had returned. He and Dalton went down to the spring again, drank many times, and then ate breakfast with the older members of the staff. A breakfast that differed very little from that of the common soldiers. Then a day or two of waiting and watching, and of confused but terrible fighting ensued. The forests were again set on fire by the bursting shells, and they were not able to rescue many of the wounded from the flames. Vast clouds again floated over the whole region, drawing a veil of dusk between the soldiers and the sun, but neither army was willing to attack the other in full force. Grant, commanding all the armies of the East, was moving meanwhile. A powerful cavalry division, he heard, had gotten behind Beauregard, who was to protect Richmond, and was tearing up an important railway line used by the Confederacy. The daring Sheridan, with another great division of cavalry, had gone around Lee's left and was wrecking another railway, and with it the rations and medical supplies so necessary to the Confederates. Grant, recognizing his antagonist's skill and courage, and knowing that to succeed he must destroy the main Southern army, resolved to attack again with his whole force. The day had been comparatively quiet, and the Army of Northern Virginia had devoted nearly the whole time to fortifying the earthworks and breastworks of logs. The young aides, as they rode on their missions, could easily see the Northern lines through their glasses. Harry's heart sank as he observed their extent. The Southern army was sadly reduced in numbers, and Grant could get reinforcement continually. But such is the saving grace of human nature that even in these moments of suspense, with one terrible battle just over and another about to begin, the soldiers of the blue and gray would speak to one another in friendly fashion in the bushes or across the Po. It was on the banks of this narrow river that Harry at last saw Shepard once more. He happened to be on foot that time, the slope being too densely wooded for his horse, and Shepard hailed him from the other side. "Good day, Mr. Kenton. Don't fire, I want to talk," he said, holding up both hands as a sign of peace. "A curious place for talking," Harry could not keep from saying. "So it is, but we're not observed here. It was almost inevitable while the armies remained face to face that we should meet in time. I want to tell you that I've met your cousin, Richard Mason, here, and his commanding officer, Colonel Winchester. Oh, I know much more about you and your relationships than you think. How is Dick? He has not been hurt, nor has Colonel Winchester. Mr. Mason has received a letter from his home and your home in Pendleton in Kentucky. The outlaws to the eastward were troublesome, but the town is occupied by an efficient Union garrison and is in no danger. His mother, and all of his friends and your friends who did not go to the war, are in good health. He thought that in my various capacities as ranger, scout, and spy I might meet you, and he asked me, if it so happened, to tell these things to you. I thank you," said Harry very earnestly, "and I'm truly sorry, Mr. Shepard, that you and I are on different sides. I suppose it's too late for you to come over to the Union and the true cause." Harry laughed. "You know, Mr. Shepard, there are no traitors in this war." "I know it, I was merely jesting." He slipped into the underbrush and disappeared. Harry confessed to himself once more that he liked Shepard, but he felt more strongly than ever that it had become a personal duel between them, and they would meet yet again in violence. That night he had little to do. It was a typical May night in Virginia, clear and beautiful, with an air that would have been a tonic to the nerves had it not been for the bitter smoke and odors that yet lingered from the Battle of the Wilderness. Before dawn, the scouts brought in a rumor that there was a heavy movement of Federal troops, although they did not know its meaning. It might portend another flank march by Grant, but a mist that had begun to rise after midnight hid much from them. The mist deepened into a fog, which made it harder for the Southern leaders to learn the meaning of the Northern movement. Just as the dawn was beginning to show a little through the fog, Hancock and Burnside and many more generals led a tremendous attack upon the Southern right center. They had come so silently through the thickets that for once the Southern leaders were surprised. The Union veterans, rushing forward in dense columns, stormed and took the breastworks with the bayonet. Many of the Southern troops, sound asleep, awoke to find themselves in the enemy's hands. Others, having no time to fire them, fought with clubbed rifles. Harry, dozing, was awakened by the terrific uproar. Even before the dawn had fairly come, the battle was raging on a long front. The center of Lee's army was broken, and the Union troops were pouring into the gap. Grant had already taken many guns and thousands of prisoners, and the bulldog of Shiloh and Vicksburg and Chattanooga was hurrying fresh divisions into the combat to extend and ensure his victory. Through the forest swelled the deep Northern cry of triumph. Harry had never before seen the Southern army in such danger, and he looked at General Lee, who had now mounted Traveler. The turmoil and confusion in front of them was frightful and indescribable. The Union troops had occupied an entire Confederate salient, and their generals, feeling that the moment was theirs, led them on, reckless of life, and swept everything before them. Harry never took his eyes from Lee. The rising sun shot golden beams through the smoke and disclosed him clearly. His face was calm and his voice did not shake as he issued his orders with rapidity and precision. The lion at bay was never more the lion. A new line of battle was formed, and the fugitives formed up with it. Then the Southern troops, uttering once more the fierce rebel yell, charged directly upon their enemy, and under the eye of the great chief whom they almost worshipped. Now Harry for the first time saw his general show excitement. Lee galloped to the head of one of the Virginia regiments, and, ranging his horse beside the colors, snatched off his hat and pointed it at the enemy. It was a picture with all the hero worship of youth he never forgot. It did not even grow dim in his memory. The great leader on horseback, his hat in his hand, his eyes fiery, his face flushed, his hand pointing the way to victory or death. It was an occasion, too, when the personal presence of a leader meant everything. Every man knew Lee, and tremendous rolling cheers greeted his arrival, the cheers that could be heard above the thunder of cannon and rifles. It infused new courage into them, and they gathered themselves for the rush upon their victorious foe. Gordon of Georgia, spurring through the smoke, seized Lee's horse by the bridle. He did not mean to have their commander-in-chief sacrificed in a charge. "This is no place for you, General Lee," he cried. "Go to the rear." Lee did not yet turn, and Gordon shouted, "These men are Virginians and Georgians who have never failed. Go back, I entreat you." Then Gordon turned to his troops and cried as he rose on his toes in his stirrups, "Men, you will not fail now." Back came the answering shout, "No, no!" and the whole mass of troops burst into one thunderous, echoing cry, "Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear!" Nor would they move until Lee turned and rode back. Then, led by Gordon, they charged straight upon their foe, who met them with an equal valor. All day long the Battle of Spottsylvania, equal in fierceness and desperation to that of the Wilderness, swayed to and fro. To Harry, as he remembered them, they were much alike. Charge and defense, defense and charge. Here they gained a little, there they lost a little. Now they were stumbling through sanguinary thickets, and then they rushed across little streams that ran red. The firing was rapid and furious to an extraordinary degree. The air rained shells and bullets. Areas of forest between the two armies were mowed down. More than one large tree was cut through entirely by rifle bullets. Other trees here, as in the Wilderness, caught fire and flamed high. Midnight put an end to the battle, with neither gaining the victory and both claiming it. Harry had lost another horse. killed under him, and now he walked almost dazed through the terrible field of Spottsylvania, where nearly 30,000 men had fallen, and nothing had yet been decided. Yet in Harry's heart the fear of the grim and silent Grant was growing. The Northern general had fought within a few days 2 battles, each the equal of Waterloo, and Harry felt sure that he was preparing for a third. The combat of the giants was not over, and with an anxious soul he waited the next dawn. They remained some days longer in the wilderness, or the country adjacent to it, and there was much skirmishing and firing of heavy artillery, but the third great pitched battle did not quite come as soon as Harry expected it. Even Grant, appalled by the slaughter, hesitated and began to maneuver again by the flank to get past Lee. Then the fighting between the skirmishers and the heavy detached parties became continuous. During the days that immediately followed, Harry was much with Sherburne. The brave colonel was one of Stuart's most trusted officers. Despite the forests and thickets, there was much work for the cavalry to do, while the 2 armies circled and circled, each seeking to get advantage of the other. Sheridan, they heard, was trying to curve about with his horsemen and reach Richmond, and Stuart with his cavalry, including Sherburne's, was sent to intercept him, Harry riding by Sherburne's side. It was near the close of May, but the air was cool and pleasant, a delight to breathe after the awful wilderness. Stuart, despite his small numbers, was in his gayest spirits, and when he overtook the enemy at a little place called Yellow Tavern, he attacked with all his customary fire and vigor. In the height of the charge, Harry saw him sink suddenly from his horse, shot through the body. He died not long afterward, and the greatest and most brilliant horseman of the South passed away to join Jackson and so many who had gone before. Harry was one of the little group who carried the news to Lee, and he saw how deeply the great leader was affected. So many of his great generals had fallen, and he was like the head of a family, bereft. Nevertheless, the lion, still at bay, was great and terrible to strike. It was barely 2 weeks after Spottsylvania when Lee took up a strong position at Cold Harbor, and Grant, confident in his numbers and powerful artillery, attacked straightway at dawn. Harry was in front during that half hour, the most terrible ever seen on the American continent, when Northern brigade after brigade charged to certain death. Lee's men, behind their earthworks, swept the field with a fire in which nothing could live. The charging columns fairly melted away before them, and when the half hour was over, more than 12,000 men in blue lay upon the red field. Grant himself was appalled, and the North, which had begun to anticipate a quick and victorious end of the war, concealed its disappointment as best it could, and prepared for another campaign. Grant and Lee, facing each other, went into trenches along the lines of Cold Harbor, and the hopes of the young Southern soldiers after the victory there rose anew. But Harry was not too sanguine, although he kept his thoughts to himself. The officers of the Invincibles had recovered from their wounds, and Colonel Leonidas Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire, sitting in a trench, resumed their game of chess. Colonel Talbot took a pawn, the first man captured by either since early spring. "That was quite a victory," he said. "Not important, Leonidas." "And why not, Hector?" "Because you left the way to your king easier. I shall promptly move along that road." "As Grant moved through the wilderness." "Don't depreciate Grant, Leonidas. He never stops pounding. We fought 2 great battles with him in the wilderness and a third at Cold Harbor, and he's still out there facing us. Can't you see the Yankees with your glasses, Harry?" "Yes, sir, quite clearly. They're about to fire a shot from a big gun in a wood. There goes." The deep note of the cannon came to them, passed on, and then rolled back in echoes like a threat. End of Chapter 16, Part 2. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. End of The Shades of the Wilderness by Joseph A. Altsheler.